Washington is a peaceful place, but that peace vanishes for good when Indiana Jones is approached by a certain Mr. Franklin and a certain Mr. Delano, who have a small favor to ask. It concerns an expedition to Easter Island, but Indy suspects from the outset that it will not be a simple research trip. Franklin and Delano are sly old dogs, and they smile too much. An American agent on the tail of a German conspiracy in the South Pacific has disappeared, and Indiana must find him. A true patriot, Indy has his own reasons to give the Nazis a little trouble. His search starts at Atoll Pal, but the tropical getaway is deceptive. Polynesia is a flowering hell, and Indy's orders are a suicide mission. In Indiana Jones and the Secret of Easter Island.
Hello and welcome back to this damn fully dualistic crusade. In this video, I'll be talking about the 6th of the 8 German-language Indiana Jones novels written by Wolfgang Hohlbein in the early 1990s that have all been given beautiful fan translations which are free to read. And as usual, I'll have links in the description below should you wish to check out this really interesting and entertaining work. Now, the books were all officially licensed by Lucasfilm, so they are official indie works, but they're not typically considered part of the official canon by the company because most people aren't even aware that these books exist. So it's been really wonderful to finally get the chance to read these due to these beautiful fan translations that were done with different methods by a variety of fans. And that's your only option to really read these unless you can track down the very elusive and expensive original German paperbacks, as they have never been reprinted and they've never been officially translated in English. Now, since these books were all written by the same author in the same time period, they do have a great number of similarities. So one very much flows into one another, and you start to notice a number of things that are sort of tropes within the author's own version of the Indiana Jones universe. And then some books have, shall we say, more and more crazier elements to their plotting, such as the second book, Longship of the Gods, which has a final act that goes way off the deep end in that area. So Secret of Easter Island is rather interestingly the shortest of these books so far and is ridiculously fast-paced, which for an indie novel actually is quite a refreshing surprise, given that a number of the books can be quite a slog to get through, especially the 2 Martin Caidin novels in the Bantam series. So I was very much surprised to see that this book was significantly shorter than the other Hohlbein novels so far. In fact, when you're looking at the actual page count of the translation, it's somewhere around only 180 pages. So this does have a quicker pace to it. And in that regard, it reminds me of Secret of the Sphinx, the last of the Max McCoy books, which similarly had a shorter page count than his other indie novels and was the fastest paced and thus most action and adventure driven of all of the Bantam series. And with the indie character, that can be a benefit. However, it can also mean that the plot may not be as developed as one would like, and that already being an issue with a lot of indie novels and even in these German books, unfortunately that comes into play here and is my biggest issue with this book. Now, I will say that I did enjoy the faster pacing and the translation so much that I didn't put this book down until I actually had to. I was able to read almost the entire book in one sitting. You will very much be able to do that if you have uninterrupted time. I just didn't have that and had to come back to it later that night and was done in 20 minutes because I didn't realize at the time that the book was significantly shorter. Now, when I start trying to describe the plot of this book to give you a basic idea, I think it will not only sort of demonstrate some of the issues in plot and character development, but will also highlight how the book having a shorter length does also contribute to the overall effectiveness of the book not being quite what it could be, and how the ending, like all of these books so far, does feel a tad rushed. But since there's already issues in plot and character development and certain subplots don't quite feel very well joined together and aren't developed enough, it really kind of throws the reader off track. And then suddenly the book's over and you find yourself kind of scratching your head a little bit. I will say it is better in that regard than the ending of the last book, The Lost People, which basically actually ended without fully resolving the plot, leaving Indiana Jones and all of our other heroes and side characters of that book stuck in another time zone or alternate universe, and never even saying if they got back to the correct time and actually fixed everything. Plus, that ended on a rather nonsensical attempt at humor that was very bizarre. So at least this book does make sense in how it ends, but it's also significantly shorter, and it really could have used extra pages in terms of a page count to, at the very least, sort of flesh out some of the other characters and definitely flesh out some of the plot, because this book basically has at least 3 or 4 different plots that are kind of just stitched together, and it also takes multiple left turns, and it is a little bit disorienting for the reader trying to figure out what the plot is and where it's going. And then we suddenly realize we're in a different act of the book, and it's got a different plot, and then there are character twists and 180s, and that happens at least 3 different times in a book that's already significantly shorter with a much faster pace to it. So that increases the reader's disorientation, I think. So Secret of Easter Island is actually a book that, as typical with these, does not open with Indiana Jones. It opens with a plane full of passengers of different nationalities and personalities that essentially crash lands on an uncharted island. They have no way off this island. They have no means to contact the outside world. And we spend quite a bit of time setting this up, and the reader becomes very familiar with the sort of tropes that are being established, and we can see where this is going. We just don't quite know how this ties into an Indiana Jones story. That section ends with our survivors squabbling and essentially cannibalizing the last bits of the downed plane in order to just get it airworthy enough for 2 of the pilots to just take off and hope they can make it far enough to perhaps get help, and trying to just be positive about it when they know it's basically a suicide mission. Also, the island may have other inhabitants on it who maybe aren't quite human or have mystical abilities, or maybe some ancient lost people. So there is some semblance of an additional threat for the survivors of this plane crash. But again, we aren't really told anything about them other than who they are and what sort of basic character traits they have, and that they're just trying to survive and reach the outside world. Then suddenly we transition to Indiana Jones, who's trying to resume his teaching career. We do have the fun sort of recurring comic relief character of his boss at the college, Griswold, who is frequently not a fan of Indiana Jones, always being absent and causing news items and all kinds of bad reputations across the world through all the adventures he gets in. And he's never there to teach his classes or grade papers or do anything like an actual instructor or professor would. So that's the sort of nice recurring through line character in these books. Unfortunately, he's not really in this book very much, but even though he actually does go on the adventure, he also quickly disappears. So it's not like the last book, Lost People, where he does sort of pop up multiple times. The main plot is laid out here for Indy and Griswold when they're approached by 2 mysterious government agents who don't really give them much information about themselves, only identifying themselves as Mr. Franklin and Mr. Delano. They essentially let Indy know that they need him to lead an expedition to Easter Island, ostensibly to discover the secrets of the famous statues, but in actuality, it's a secret government mission to try and find what happened to one of the people who were actually on that plane that went down. That person was actually working as a government operative and had seemingly gotten secret Nazi information about proposed and actually constructed secret Nazi submarine bases all across the Pacific. And they were trying to get out unnoticed on this charter flight, essentially, with this secret information that could shift the balance of world power. And that is the MacGuffin we're given at first. And so Indy's real directive is to try to find the sort of uncharted areas that plane might have gone down and see if he can find the missing secret operative, if he's even still alive. And so the reader is several steps ahead of Indiana Jones from this point, basically until the end of the book, because we can already see, oh, that's the plane crash from the opening that was never explained why it was here. Oh, it's that guy from the plane crash who survived on this deserted island. And then we know that Indy's going to have to try and track them down while ostensibly still pretending to be on just an expedition to go to Easter Island. This is enough to have a good adventure plot and to get the ball rolling, no pun intended, as Indy loves running from balls or boulders. But once we transition to the Pacific and Indy is, starting to not actually do the Easter Island expedition and look for the missing man and the downed flight, we essentially then kind of move into another plot entirely, because all of a sudden there's a couple duplicitous character reveals where a character does a 180 and actually reveals their ulterior motives, and then suddenly it becomes a plot about being stuck or trapped on this uncharted island and running into people who have been there, apparently surviving on the land for months and months. And the reader realizes before Indiana Jones that these are some of the survivors of the plane crash and that they've been living on the land, but obviously they're fighting against some force. And this is revealed to be the sort of lost tribe who live on the island and have already captured some of the survivors, and the others have basically just been holding them at bay as best they could with sort of makeshift weapons and things. Of course, then they quickly encounter the actual lost tribe and all get captured. And these people are revealed to be the descendants of the original inhabitants of Easter Island. And of course, because this is a Wolfgang Hohlbein German Indiana Jones novel, some of them are of giant stature and seemingly invulnerable when Indy has to fight them, because all of these books so far have had at least one, if not several, different characters of giant proportions who are seemingly invulnerable to most things, if not everything, and Indy will have to fight them at some point and try to not get killed. This happens in every Hohlbein book, so you know there's going to be a giant or a giant figure somewhere. Indy does actually find the surviving member of the plane crash, who was the U.S. government operative with the sort of stolen Nazi secret plans, but this is essentially made worthless because that MacGuffin isn't really referenced much after that point, because the new MacGuffin is that the Lost Tribe has a leader who has a particular sort of fire crystal with supernatural properties, they are told, and then eventually do see that it has the ability to not only burn people alive, but have some sort of magical, almost fire laser qualities to be able to kill countless men and lay waste to the landscape on a grand scale. And this just so happens to now be wielded by their new leader, who is actually the elderly German lady from the plane crash from the opening, who is seemingly possessed by some sort of ancient queen goddess fire spirit demon who may actually live within the fire crystal itself. It's never quite explained because there are times where the old elderly German lady appears lucid and times where she's speaking in creepy demon voice, so it's like she kind of goes back and forth. So the new MacGuffin is this magical fire crystal with incredible destructive properties that Indy and the other characters witness firsthand when a Nazi submarine suddenly surfaces off the island, because one of the government agents was actually a secret Nazi spy who tailed them there and is just after this sort of fire crystal. Then, to their horror, Indy and everyone, well, they can't really watch, they have to keep their eyes shut, but basically in front of them, all of the Nazis except the double agent are horribly burned with the magical fire crystal laser thing into absolute nothingness. And the surviving double agent is not only blind, but almost charred to literal death, and then is just basically on his deathbed for the rest of the book. So then the plot essentially becomes one of our characters are all from various walks of life, and they find themselves now not only in the clutches of the lost tribe of descendants of the original inhabitants of Easter island, who actually manufacture in a very elaborate sort of internal factory. They actually build more of the incredible statues that are what we see on Easter Island, so the giant heads. But they also worship the fire crystal and their new sort of goddess queen, who is there to fulfill this sort of prophecy of getting them off this island back to their original home. And in doing so, this will seemingly cause some sort of apocalypse, and if they're not able to do this, it will still cause some sort of apocalypse. And this island is also a giant volcano, essentially, so they actually kind of live inside the volcano. They have this whole sort of social hierarchy and architecture building with the volcano and the lava. And interestingly, Indy and all our characters are actually imprisoned on what's essentially a platform just freestanding inside the volcano with an open doorway. So it's not like they're in a jail cell, because it's the sort of scenario of, well, there's nowhere to go except jump into the lava pit of the volcano and die, or wait to be taken off and killed and die. So Indy then has to try to sweet talk the elderly German lady possessed by crazy fire demon goddess queen, and see if he can figure out a way of getting them all out of this, and also, preventing an apocalypse. Then he's given a task that he has to actually translate the full ancient prophecy from a language no one knows, that's a dead language that even the tribe and the possessed queen does not know, in order for the prophecy to be completely fulfilled. And he's only got 3 or 4 days to do this. So then you introduce more of a ticking clock factor, and Indy has to use his wits and his archaeological knowledge, being given an impossible task with an incredible deadline, and the stakes are, they are for the world itself. Now, that's a great dramatic setup, and that's enough of a plot to have a great Indiana Jones story in and of itself. But it's within a relatively short book with very fast plotting that already has, maybe at least 2 or 3 additional major plot ideas. There's several MacGuffins in this story. There are many different side characters who we don't actually get to know a lot about because they're not really well developed. And then there's multiple characters that have complete character reversals as they reveal their true nature. And Indy has to navigate all of this while also dealing with the head of the lost tribe of original inhabitants of Easter Island, wielding a magical fire crystal possessed by a demon goddess in the form of an elderly old German lady. And it's a lot to take in all at once, even though, again, the stakes are quite high, with it being probable apocalypse if Indy fails, or if Indy succeeds, he has no way of knowing if they will actually let them go. Chances are they most likely will not. So in any event, Indy is not only facing mortal peril and the destruction of the world for just himself, but for all of the other captives. This is also with the threat of the looming sort of ceremony that's supposed to take place with Indy's translation of the ancient prophecies, and the idea that at any point, other Nazi submarines or vessels could show up around the island to swarm in and start another giant cataclysmic battle to try and take possession of the fire crystal. Or the other forces who know that they're sort of there could show up or be signaled. So there are multiple interested parties, shall we say, who could show up to this uncharted volcanic island and suddenly upset the game board, and everything could go haywire at any minute. So Indy's having to think on his feet, and it goes well, again, with the faster plotting. So again, the fact that this book moves fast does at least help to make some of this stuff play a little bit better than it would had it been this little developed and had a slower pace to it, and thus had the sort of plotting nature that a lot of the middle acts, especially of indie books, can have. This book does have a very rushed feeling climax, so once the book is actually over, the reader is sort of left wondering a bit about what they just read and having to think back and sort of put the pieces together. And because this is a shorter book, you're getting through that final act, which everything has really heated up, literally, because they're inside a volcano. And it's one event after another, after another, after another, and then suddenly the book's over. After multiple plot twists have come, boom, 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 and in the last 20 to 30 pages. It's pretty much nonstop. So in that sense, it does have the flavor in areas of Temple of Doom, because you have the sort of ancient rituals being performed and the sort of fiery volcano underground feel, and Indy being a captive with others he's having to think about, and dealing with the mad high priest, except here it's not Molaram, it's old German lady possessed by the evil fire demon goddess, and having the fire crystal that can turn anyone and anything into like a fire laser fried heap of ashes. So this may sound either appealing or unappealing to you if you were interested in reading this. However, I would like to finish by describing the sort of final set piece that Indiana Jones finds himself thrust into, because if anything in this book will entice someone to read this, especially if anything that I've described so far hasn't gotten your attention. I mean, notably, old German lady possessed by fire demon goddess spirit with a fire crystal that laser fries an entire beach full of Nazi soldiers who just came out of a U-boat. That's worth the price of admission. But the ceremony that takes place, where Indy's supposed translation of the ancient ritual and prophecy is supposed to be read, and involves this process of having all of the sort of warriors dress in these handmade ceremonial garments with basically lots of jewels and skins and things, and they're sort of built into wing-like shapes, and they essentially attach themselves to what is basically like a string or a rope of some type, and then they literally jump off the platform because they're all inside the volcano, and then use the thermals coming off of the lava itself to then actually fly around, only suspended by these very tiny handmade rope cables. And then suddenly Indiana Jones is tied on one of these and thrown out and expected to fight to the death. And they all have their own weapons of choice. And what does Indy have? His bullwhip. So it takes the reader a minute to sort of visualize this very over-the-top set piece. But essentially you have Indiana Jones only suspended by tiny handmade rope cables, literally flying over the lava inside a volcano, and having to fight off giant warriors in jeweled flying costumes who have, giant axes and swords and daggers and all this other stuff, and they're fighting to the death, and Indy just has his bullwhip and his wits and is just trying to not die. And of course, they're constantly not even able to see from all the intense heat because they're literally flying inside a volcano over a lava pit. And this is really one of the most beautifully over-the-top moments in any of the Indy books, and that's saying a lot. And it does take the reader a minute to sort of be able to visualize this because it's so out there. And then I started thinking, this is really reminding me of something, but I can't quite think of what it is. It took me a minute, and then suddenly I realized this is Volcano Thunderdome. You don't have any entity on top. You've got old German lady possessed by fire demon goddess spirit, cackling madly as she's hoping that Indiana Jones gets either killed or dumped into the lava, or killed and dumped into the lava. And they technically have their choice of weapons, and the deck is stacked against our hero, and they're, just kind of flying around, and basically imagine the Thunderdome fight from Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome if it was in a volcano. And they're all just sort of flying and zooming around on little tiny cables that keep getting cut or start to burn in the intense heat. So yeah, if this book doesn't sound like it was for you, or it doesn't sound appealing enough, Volcano Thunderdome. I did not know I was going to get that in this book. I didn't know that was something I needed, but apparently I did, because I loved the sequence, as out there and ridiculous and over the top as it was. So I think there are a lot of fun elements in this book. I think it reads well. I really loved the faster pacing of this, but even though this book has some major issues with plot development and even side character development, and kind of doesn't really do a good job at stitching its subplots together and leaves the reader hanging, Volcano Thunderdome makes up for a lot. I really think that people need to at least read this book just to get to that sequence to see how amazingly over the top that is. And it's a good sequence too. It sounds silly as heck as I'm trying to describe it, but it's well done. And it even took me a minute to realize what exactly I was reading. I had to stop and literally go, am I reading this right? This is this is like ridiculously out there. But yeah, I think the major selling point of Indiana Jones and the Secret of Easter Island is literally 2 words: Volcano Thunderdome. Well, I guess technically it would be Volcano Dome then, or Thunder Volcano Dome, something like that. But yeah, it is a book with ridiculously entertaining moments, chiefly among them Volcano Thunderdome. So ultimately, Indiana Jones and the Secret of Easter Island, it's a satisfying read. It's a good, quick, fast read if you're looking for just an adventure to jump into that is also recognizably Indiana Jones in tone. You won't be disappointed there. However, you will be disappointed in most everything else, because it's almost as if there are like 3 different plots that aren't fully developed into a main plot sort of stitched together. And because the book is significantly shorter than the other books in this series, it feels even less developed than some of those. And it has a lot of the same issues in terms of not having the plot being as clear and concise as one would like, and wishing for a little bit more narrative development. Basically, what this feels like is if you took one of the previous books in this series, like especially the last book, Lost People, where I talk about how in the second act there's a lot of meandering trying to get to the actual final location or the final villain, or get the full plot reveal of what the MacGuffin is actually going to do, or what function it's going to fulfill within the plot. This book, Easter Island, kind of feels like you just took that out. You took the meandering sort of second act out and just immediately got more to the action and get everybody to the island and really turn everything up to 11 in intensity. So in that sense, it is an improvement on that aspect from some of the past books. So of the German novels so far, this is one of the better ones. It's one of the ones I prefer most. I wouldn't put it as the best of the series so far, which I still think is Gold of El Dorado, but this even sort of addresses some of the issues in that book of having a bit of a meandering plot in the second act. So again, there's something to be said for the faster pace and the action piling on and really driving the reader forward. Again, I almost read this in one sitting. I would have had I had enough time. And then I literally sat back down that night and pulled it back out and finished it in 20 minutes because I didn't realize I was almost at the end of the book, because I didn't realize there was only 20 more pages. And I'm like, wait, what? So it's a book you'll finish very quickly. It's a book you'll enjoy to a certain extent, but your mileage is going to vary if you're like me and you prefer a really well-rounded and established narrative. You're going to be left with a feeling like you're kind of still hanging on the line in the Volcano Thunderdome. I couldn't resist. It's Volcano Thunderdome. It's such a concept that I can't let go of. I just have it in my head, playing on like a loop of Indiana Jones on a little wire inside a volcano, just trying to bullwhip warriors with axes. Yeah, it's just it's irresistible. To talk about the artwork a little bit, we have the original Goldman German paperback cover. This is in the same style as the other books in the series, so we have an artist rendering of Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones with the actual statues of Easter Island all lined up on the bottom, and a good usage of color. It's basically more like a landscape image, but all the books in the series have this same aesthetic. At first, it seems a little bit plain, but once you see all the covers in the series and you realize they all went for this, it does have a certain style to it, and it does look quite nice. This one, the rendering of Harrison Ford's likeness, it's not absolutely the best. It's solid, but most of the books in this series are kind of like this, where you can obviously tell it's supposed to be Harrison Ford, and the likeness is pretty good. But this is just one where it's maybe more like 70 to 80% there compared to some of the others, which I think are a lot closer to 100% there. There's also a second cover made by Indy the fan magazine that first started doing some of these fan translations. So this was generated so you could actually print your own copy of the fan translation. Now, this has a pretty nice mock-up. We've got a good likeness of Harrison Ford, where it's sort of Indy's head in a sort of jungle-type setting with the sort of volcanic background, giving you the actual proper visual locale where the story takes place. And it's a good cover and design and layout with a similar sort of aesthetic of having basically a big Indy head sort of floating in a landscape that's actually tied into the book in question. So it's a really nicely put together cover by Indy Mag. Now, this translation was done by Rachel Snyder, who is a native German speaker, and so this is basically one of the fan translations that is done by an actual German speaker and not having to use some sort of translation assistance. And that does seem to help a little bit in terms of the readability of the text. All of the translations have been great so far, don't get me wrong, but when you actually read the explanatory notes, it will identify, which fans did which book translation, and that they all used different methods. So when you read some of the others that, especially the ones that used online translators, there's maybe one or two spots where we're reading in English. The text is just a little bit not necessarily unclear, but there's maybe an occasional moment where one of the word choices is a little bit odd, and you have to think for an extra second and go, oh, okay, I see what that means there. And that's to be expected with anything like this, I think. But getting to read one of these translated by an actual German speaker, it seems like the text does flow just a little bit better. I didn't run into any, a little word choice moment or something like that. So it's just something to note when you're reading these, that due to the nature of how different fans had to use different approaches to do the translations, that some books may have a few quirks here and there, and this is one of the ones that doesn't, because it was actually done by a native German speaker. And again, this is nothing against any of the other translations. They just simply had to use different methods, and the fact that people took the time to do any of this and then make it freely available within the fan community or for anyone is just absolutely fantastic. And of course, my fedora is off to them with absolute thanks. So those are my thoughts on Indiana Jones and the Secret of Easter Island, the sixth of the 8 Wolfgang Hohlbein German Indiana Jones novels, and easily the fastest paced indie book I've read since The Secret of the Sphinx, which is the last of the Bantam books. This is a really fun read. It is a bit frustrating in areas because there are definite narrative aspects and characters who aren't really as developed as they should be, but it's still a plot that you can follow. It never becomes fully unclear, and thankfully the book is so tightly paced and shorter that It never meanders, it never starts to plod along as pretty much all the other indie books do at some point, usually. And there are some aspects, the faster pacing, that are an improvement on the other Holbein books in this series so far. And it's definitely a book you can start and finish in one sitting because you get that invested in it. And it reads really well in the fan translation, and the action is pretty heavy, and it's a shorter book, so you pretty much start it and you want to keep reading. You want to finish it. And if you've got uninterrupted time, you will finish this in one sitting. And you get enough enjoyment out of it that it's a pleasant experience. But there are a number of drawbacks that do sort of hold it back from reaching that top tier of Indiana Jones novels. But of the German books so far, I do think it is one of the better ones. It was a really enjoyable book to read. I just wish it was a bit better plotted, and I think it could have been longer for sure. I don't know why it had to be significantly shorter at only about 180 pages. I think if it was more like at least 200 pages, but really more like 250 pages, maybe 300, maybe it didn't need quite that much, but it definitely needed some more pages to be able to play around with some stuff and develop a number of elements and characters. I think that would have made it not only more fleshed out, but it would have made it more satisfying and not had, some sort of unanswered questions, and the reader wouldn't be sort of scratching their head as much throughout it, essentially. But again, I leave you with the two words that summarize this book best: Volcano Thunderdome. If that doesn't entice you to at least give this book a try, nothing else really will. So as always, I hope my babblings about the world of our favorite intrepid archaeologist and the world of Indiana Jones fiction has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do go and check out these incredible fan translation efforts. They have been made freely available and have been done entirely as a labor of love. Each is worth your time as an indie fan. Even if you find that you only enjoy some of the books, I think it's a really worthwhile experience for every indie fan to actually read this whole series, especially now that we finally have the ability to do so in these incredible fan translations. So definitely check these out. I'll have the link in the description below, and share them with fellow indie fans who may have not read them, because again, this is a definite aspect of the world of indie that is very seldom discussed and has been very niche simply due to the unavailability of these stories only being in the original German paperbacks all this time. So as always, keep reading, keep cracking the whip, and thank you ever so much for watching.